We're looking at loops where we started off with some of the basics of loops. Then we looked at how we can use the for value loop to run a loop over numbers. What if we want to now run a loop over variables? Now, so we'll look at that. For this, the syntax is going to be for each x. Again, you can write x, you can write I, you can name this anything, right? X, I, N, K, whatever, right? For each I or X or whatever of a local, global, or wireless. So we're going to use either for each I of local, for each I of global, or for each I of wireless. Let's see how we're going to do that. So the first approach that we can use when we want to run a loop over variables is we can add the variables in the loop through locals or globals. What do I mean by that? Let's use the auto data set. Say you want to run a loop where you want to summarize the variables weight, price, and MPG. So one option is that you want to run a loop over variables, right? So we can add the variables in the loop through local. We can first create a local that stores all those variables. So here the syntax that we're using is we're writing local. We're writing the name of that local in which you want to store the variables on which you want to run the loop. The name of that local is vars, and then we write the values that you want to store in this particular local vars, and it's these variables you want to run the loop over: weight, price, and MPG, right? So one way you can run a loop over variables is you create a local way in which you can store the variables on which you want to run the loop on. And here I created a variable vars which stores these three variables. We've created local vars that stores these three variables, right? Now let's run the loop. Now how do we run the loop? For each, again, you can write this x or y, doesn't really matter, okay, and anything. For each x of local vars, right? So what I'm telling Stata is that I want to run a loop such that in the loop x takes all values that are present inside this local vars, right? So this is the name of the local that I created. So the first step is to create the local where you want to store your in which you want to store your variables on which you want to run the loop, and then you tell Stata that x is going to take all values that belong in this local vars, and then you just write whatever you want to do inside the loop, right? In this case, we're telling Stata to display in red x, right? So whatever so display in red x, which would basically be first x takes a value where that's present in vars, then x would take a value price, then MPG, and we're asking you to display in red each of them and then to summarize them. So if we run this, so it would be like this, right? So this is, oh sorry, my bad, display in red x. We had to put this in double quotation marks. Let's see, why did we have to put double quotation marks here? Because in this case, here we have to put double quotation marks because you want Stata to display in red string, right? Because x contains weight, price, MPG, right? So we need to enclose it in double quotation marks over here. Because whenever we are using the display command with string, we have to enclose it in double quotation marks. Now here is something very important to keep in mind. With local, where we define, here we've defined the local, right? And here we're calling this local vars, right? Here we've defined this local vars, here we're calling this local vars, right? So we have to run the do file in one go because locals stay in memory for one do file session. As soon as the do file ends, locals go for memory. Like if you recall, I ran this entire code of line together, right? Where I defined the local vars and when I use the local vars to run the loop. That works, right? What if I run it separately, right? First I had run this line of code and see end to do file. Whenever do file ends, locals go from your memory. So since this do file is ended, so this local vars is no longer in my memory. Now if I run this line of code separately, it won't run, right? Because the local has gone from empty, right? So whenever you're using locals to run a loop of variables, you need to make sure where you're defining the local over here vars, where you're storing the variables in it, and where you call that local to run the loop, you have to make sure you run this line of code in one go. Because as soon as end of do file comes, the local goes away from the memory, right? So that's that. So that this was one way that you can run a loop of variables. You can first store the variables in a local and then you can run the loop over that local. But you have to be careful that you have to run the code in one go where you're defining the local and where you're calling the local, because locals go from your memory once the do file ends. So the next option is we can use var list, right? How do we do that? So what we're saying is for each x, again x, I, k, and anything you can specify this as, doesn't matter. For each x of var list. So when you've written a var list, after that, now you can either, there are multiple ways that you can specify. After var list, you have to specify your variables. Here, either you can name all the variables like we did here, make, price, MPG. There are alternatives also. We did this, right? Where with var list, we did var list x, y, z, right? We just wrote make, price, MPG. So what you're doing is when you're specifying var list, after that you have to give the name of all the variables. Now, there are multiple ways you can specify that. You name them all out like we've done here. Or if they're in the correct order, you can do X dash Z. What's this telling data? If in the data set, then the proper order, if make comes in price and MPG comes, or then consecutively in the data set, then you can specify them like this as well. This is telling data to take all variables from X to Z inclusive. Let's see in this data set, are they in a particular order? So we wanted, oh, so this was not make, this was weight actually. So weight, okay, so price, MPG, weight, C are not in a specific order here, so I can't really do that. So price and MPG are together, but weight isn't. If they were all three in the correct order, then we could have just done price to weight. If I do right now price to weight, it will include everything over here. Price, MPG, rep 7, 8, headroom, trunk weight. We don't want that. Obviously, one way is that we can change the order and bring weight next to price and MPG using the order command. And if they are in this right order, then you can call the variables. You can specify the variables like this. You don't have to name all of them like we've done here. You can just name the variables in the variable in the beginning, the variable in the end of that order. It will include all the variables between them. If you want to run it, if you want to specify all variables, like you're running a loop and you want to use all variables in it, then you don't have to name all of them. Or also then you don't have to name all of them. After while list, what you can do is uh, you can just type underscore all or just use the static, right? So if you want to say run a loop over every single variable, so after writing for each X of while list, either write underscore all or use the static. And then you also have a wildcards, so say, so what you can do is type, so it should be while list underscore all or use, right? Um, So yeah, so this is this, and then obviously, then you can use wildcards also. For example, if I have some variables, all of them start, and I want to run a loop of variables, all of them start with Q27, and the end can be different. So we can use wildcards, right? You can write Q27 if all variables start with this, and then you have a wildcard. Obviously, you can also, if you have variables that start with something different and end with Q27, then you can also do while list the static Q27, right? So with while list, when you're specifying variables, you can either type all of them. If they're in the correct order, you can specify them using a dash like this. Data will include all the variables between X and Z inclusive. If you want to specify all variables, then you can use underscore all, or we can use the static. And you can use wildcards also if we have variables, if you're running the loop of variables which either have a starting part common or variables which have an ending part common, because you can use the static for the part that is different. So these are just different ways that we can feed the variables to wireless. And after that, you write the loop in the body of the loop similarly, right? We again want to display in red X, and then you want to summarize X. Right, so this is doing the exact same thing. So when you're running a loop over variables, you can either first store the variables in a local and then run the loop over it. Here, keep in mind, where you define the local, like here, and where you're using the local, you have to run this code in one go. So you have to run it like this. You can't first run this part and then run this part separately. You can't do that because locals go from the memory once the do file ends. Another alternative option when you're running a loop of variables is to use while list. And within while list, there are multiple ways that you can use to specify the variables. You can type all of them. You can use a dash to specify them, provided in the right order. You can also change the order using the order command. And if you want to specify all variables, then you can use an static underscore all. And if the variables have some starting part or ending part common, you can use wildcards also.